Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek Voyager Season 7. This video is part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Star Trek Voyager one season at a time. This video is where I cover Voyager's final season, Season 7. For this video, I will assume those watching this video have seen all Season 7, and thus I won't spend any time to explain what each episode is about, so I can just jump straight into it. So, those who have been watching my coverage of Voyager may know I did not think very highly of Season 7, and through this series I've been speculating on which season I think will be the worst of Voyager, Season 3 or Season 7. However, I wanted to rewatch Season 7 before making that determination, but now that I have, I think I'm going to stick with Season 3 as the worst season of Voyager. Because watching Season 7 again, I realize it's not quite as bad as I remember. In fact, there are several episodes I liked much better on a rewatch than I thought I would. But don't get me wrong, this is still a bad season. The first half of the season is actually pretty decent, and it has some good episodes in it. But it's the second half of the season that really goes downhill with a series of poorly written, poorly executed episodes, all leading up to the worst episode of all, the crap excuse for a series finale Endgame. It's very apparent to me that towards the later half of the season, the showrunners Rick Berman and Brennan Braga had their heads up Enterprise's ass preparing for that ill-conceived show, so Voyager just went by the wayside, and they half-assed the writing for the run of the final run of episodes, as it was apparent they didn't really care anymore and just wanted the show to be over with. Which is a huge shame, as it shortchanges its amazing cast of characters and crew who were invested in the show being good, and also the fans who stuck with the show for 7 years and deserved a good ending that honored the time they spent watching this great show. But instead, the writers half-assed it and gave all the fans the middle finger instead of even trying to make it good. So, this season, more than any other, I feel shortchanged a brilliant cast of dynamic characters in order to focus almost entirely on the Doctor in 7 of 9. In fact, in Season 7, Voyager might as well just change his name to the Doctor in 7 of 9 show, featuring Captain Janeway, as those were the only characters that mattered. Dynamic characters like Chakotay, Tuvok, Harry Kim, and Neelix all became generic background characters with no real personality, whose only function was to service the Doctor in 7 of 9 storylines. And I'm not the only one who thought so. Chakotay actor Robert Beltran and the Harry Kim actor Garrett Wang were very vocal about how upset they were that their characters were shortchanged and marginalized in the final seasons of Voyager, and I could not agree with them more. And then you had B'Elanna Torres, who's reduced from a dynamic, very interesting engineer character struggling to overcome her anger issues, and she's reduced to being Tom Paris's woman. And that's basically all she was this season. Now, don't get me wrong, I like 7 of 9 and the Doctor. They're two of my favorite characters. But the signature call of any Star Trek spinoff from Next Generation to Voyager is its ensemble cast of characters, and that's what made the show so great. It seems to me Berman and Braga were already getting in the Enterprise mindset, where the show only focused on 3 characters and the rest were bland cast of nobodies who existed only to serve the main 3 characters. And frankly, that was one of the main reasons why that show failed. And it appears to me that this failed mindset that made Enterprise's first 2 seasons the worst years in all of Star Trek actually began here with the final season of Voyager. So now let me get into each episode of Season 7, starting with the premiere episode, Unimatrix Zero Part 2. Now, I talked a bit about this horrible episode for Part 1, but Part 2 I feel actually is even worse. The main issue with this episode is the audience is giving no real reason to care about the goal they are trying to accomplish. We're told repeatedly that it's important, but we're not shown that. The Unimatrix Zero inhabitants are just generic characters that we never actually grow to care about. 7 of 9's romance with one of its members is bland and uninteresting, but most of all, the knowledge that any lasting effects will be wiped clean as soon as the episode finishes via the almighty reset button made me feel like the entire thing was just a big waste of time. I knew this wouldn't impact the Borg Collective at all, as many episodes were claiming it would, and I knew it would never be spoken of ever again, and I was dead right. It made it pretty difficult to give one solitary fuck about what was going on. And of course, this episode continues the cartoonification of the Borg and the Borg Queen, so there's that. And also, the inclusion of the Klingon character really annoys me, as again, the Borg actually didn't go into the Alpha Quadrant that much, and when they did, they never actually brought survivors back to the Delta Quadrant. It's a small thing, I know, and there could be examples that occurred off-screen, but still it's hard for me to think of the appearance of the Klingon character as nothing more than contrived pandering. So all in all, another horrible use of the Borg that was typically, typical of Borg episodes in Voyager's final seasons. So next episode is Imperfection. And this is one of those episodes I appreciate a lot more on my recent rewatch. I had also always thought poorly of this episode and considered it for among the worst of Voyager's episodes. But watching it again, I realized it does do a good job of telling a dynamic character story about 709's mentor-type relationship with Ichab. And we get some really fascinating interactions between these two characters. I suppose I was always dismissive of this episode because the characters, a character getting sick and refusing to accept it storyline has become an overused trope in Star Trek, from Next Generation episodes like The Lost in Ethics and Odo's founder disease storyline from Deep Space Nine. However, if I look past this storyline, it's actually very interesting. I can see it does a great job of exploring Seven's character development, as well as Ichab's, as it shows he's willing to risk his own life to save her, and that was actually really powerful. So next episode is Drive, which is another episode that wasn't quite as bad as I remembered it. Don't get me wrong though, this is an episode about Tom and B'Elanna entering the Delta Flyer into a space race, so no way in hell that doesn't suck. But that being said, it wasn't quite as terrible as I remember it being, as it does have, some mildly interesting character stories, with B'Elanna doubting her relationship with Tom and with Harry falling for a woman who turns out to be a terrorist. So it was enough so this episode wasn't terrible, but it's still not good. I mean, a space race? Come on. This is so dumb. It's like pod racing, but in space. Pfft. And it tops it all off with Tom and B'Elanna, the couple that never should have been together in the first place, and a couple I'm still not buying, no matter how hard the show tries to cram them down my throat. It ends with them getting married, so the episode has to suck to some degree. It is funny, though, when B'Elanna was doubting whether or not to break up with Tom, saying things like, oh, maybe we just don't work as a couple. I was like yelling at the screen, you're goddamn right, it's about time you figure this out. But of course she has to take this completely correct revelation back so they can get married at the end of the episode and completely throw B'Elanna's character down the toilet. But yeah, I know, I'm a stick in the mud, and Tom and B'Elanna are actually great together, yada yada, whatever. So, next episode is Repression, and this is actually an example of an episode that was much worse than I remembered. The whole thing felt empty and pointless in a lame attempt to connect the show to its roots by doing a Maquis-centered storyline that fails miserably. The heart of this episode, the heart of the issue of this episode, is the main motivation behind this Bajorn Vedic is what he's doing makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It's just ridiculous. And then they try to address this in the episode itself, where a character even asks, oh, what could he possibly gain by having the Maquis taking over a ship thousands of light years from Earth? And the only answer given was, oh, well, at least the Maquis will be somewhere. I'm sorry, but that's bullshit. I don't buy that for a second. The backup explanation is that he's crazy. Oh, come on. That's the very definition of lazy writing. So basically, he wanted to brainwash former members of the Maquis to reject their Starfleet shipmates, friends and partners they've grown close to and have been working with for years. Why? They're just brainwashed zombies at this stage and not even real Maquis. It's preposterous. And how easily that Tuvok manages to just fix things with a simple mind meld is so dumb, it's unbelievable. And at the end of the episode, after the ship suffered through a mutiny where many could have died and the whole, half the crew could have been stranded on the planet forever, they simply go to the movies afterwards and laugh about it. Ha ha ha. God, this episode sucks. So, next episode is Critical Care. This episode was actually really decent. This was a very thinly veiled social commentary piece that was in fact very preachy on the current American healthcare system. However, since I completely agree with the commentary, in fact find it a very important, vital message, I find this episode to be one of the more powerful social message episodes in Star Trek, as I think it delivers the message that treating healthcare like a privilege and not a right is in fact cruel and barbaric. In this episode, the aliens who illegally acquire the doctor's program have a merit-based system where only those whom are deemed valuable to society are permitted proper health care treatment. In fact, resources that could save lives are wasted on the elite who don't really need it, which I believe is a powerful analogy to the current American system where the rich and elite acquire resources they don't need, whereas the poor and indigent die where these resources could have saved their lives. This is personified perfectly with the character of Tebis, a young man who has a lot of hope and dreams that the doctor takes a liking to, who dies because he's not deemed valuable enough by society. However, this episode isn't perfect, as I found the final resolution to this episode happened far too easily, and it featured a subplot about the common thief who stole the doctor's program, which I found a bit ridiculous. And unlike most social commentary episodes of Trek, that's not really more to the story, and perhaps is a bit too obvious a preachy mouthpiece. So, a very powerful episode, but not without its flaws. So after that, we get the Inside Man, and frankly, I found this episode a bit frustrating to watch, as we know that this Barclay hologram is corrupted by the Ferengi, who are using it to try to steal 709's nanoprobes, but the characters don't. As on Voyager, they don't know the hologram is fooling them, and those on Pathfinder don't know it's the Ferengi that stole the hologram and is using it for their own purposes, but we, the audience, know. So it's so frustrating to see everyone be so ignorant of what we know, where we just want to scream at the TV screen, go, figure it out, you idiots! This was even worse on Voyager, because it was beyond obvious there was something wrong with Barclay hologram, especially as he started acting more bizarre, and yet the Doctor was the only one who even slightly suspected him, and even then he quickly admits that he was wrong. What's more frustrating is that we don't even see the Voyager crew realize how dumb they were being in this episode, and it happens off screen. Not to mention the whole storyline with the Ferengi using a pulsar to steal nanoprobes from all the way in the Delta Quadrant is beyond impossible, especially considering the length they had to go to accomplish this. Granted, they tried to say the profit would be unimaginable, but still, the prospect that they pull off a scheme so complicated and far-fetched is simply ridiculous, making the whole premise of this episode incredibly contrived. So next episode is Body and Soul, and this is another episode that wasn't quite as bad as I remember. It has the story of the Doctor having to inhabit 7 of 9's body to hide from aliens who are fighting a war against holograms. This story was actually pretty interesting, as it explored the dynamic between 7 of 9 and the Doctor, on how 7 of 9 takes for granted all the sensations that the Doctor never gets to experience, and to see him indulge when he was in control of her body made complete and total sense. And Jerry Ryan does an amazing job playing Robert Picardo. However, the storyline of the aliens was a bit far-fetched, how they were just, so indigent, against killing all the holograms, and the way that the dude was flirting with 7 of 9 was just plain silly. So, it's not a very good episode, but it's an okay one. So, next episode is Nightingale. Now, in my introduction to this video, I talked about how Harry Kim was shoved to the side and underused, and I realized some of you may have been thinking, well, what about Nightingale? Because this is a Harry Kim-centric episode. Yes, but it's not a very good one. And more to the point, it doesn't do a very good job of exploring his character, as he comes off as a stereotypical douche. And there have been great episodes like Timeless and Warhead that does do a really good job of fleshing out Harry Kim's character, so it can be done. But in the 7th season, the writers were determined to turn him into a bland, uninteresting character, even when they focused on him. Now, this episode wasn't altogether bad. It was entertaining enough to see Kim help aliens he thought were on a medical mission, but were in fact trying to return a cloak to their people. But there wasn't a lot to this episode, and the storyline of Kim learning to become a leader was really fake, as he was acting uncharacteristically dumb at the start of his command. It was all kind of bland. But more to the point, why in the hell is Harry Kim still an ensign? This was perhaps the biggest flaw in the 7th season of Voyager. It makes no sense. In fact, Tuvok got promoted to Lieutenant Commander. Tom Paris got demoted to ensign and then promoted back to lieutenant, and Kim is still an ensign. This is in fact something his actor Garrett Wong complained about to the showrunner Brennan Braga, and his very lame response was, well, somebody has to be the ensign. I'm sorry, but that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. A, why? And B, no they don't. Braga must not know the meaning of the term character development, which would be far more interesting than keeping Kim an ensign forever, which is just stupid. I really have a lot of sympathy for Garrett Wong, who's a good actor, and he did the best that he could with Harry Kim, but the writers continually failed him and completely ruined his character. But that's just the way it is. So, next episode is Flesh and Blood. Now, it's time for everyone's favorite segment, What the Fuck Are They Doing Here? Where here we get perhaps the worst example ever seen, where Voyager runs into the Hirogen, who were last seen in Season 4 3 years ago. Since that time, Voyager found a wormhole that took 2 years off their journey in the episode Night. It entered a slipstream drive in the episode Timeless. It took 10 years off their journey, and then they entered a Borg transwarp conduit in Dark Frontier that took 15 years off their journey, and then they used an intergalactic catapult in the Voyager conspiracy that took 3 years off their journey. So those jumps alone should place Voyager 30 years travel from where they encountered the Hirogen in Season 4. And that's not even counting all the normal travel Voyager has been doing the entire time trying to get home. I suppose this brings up a bigger issue of why Voyager hasn't gotten to the Beta Quadrant by now, which frankly I was kind of expecting them to do in the 7th season. But still, even if you discount some of these time jumps, or say they didn't really jump that far, as if they were exaggerating or whatever, there should still be absolutely nowhere near the Hirogen. Now, I know some of you may be thinking, well, wait a second, Mark. The Hirogen are a pneumatic species that are spread out far and wide. True, but these Hirogens specifically have the holodeck technology Voyager gave them in Season 4, and no less, they have it at a stationary station. And no doubt this station is like 30 years travel from where they received it. This is absolutely inexcusable. Now, in Season 6, we saw a Hirogen fighting in an arena at Zakate, but that was excusable because Hirogen are nomadic, because that was a single Hirogen who could have had nothing to do with the Hirogen Voyager encountered before. But here, these Hirogen are clearly the same because of the holodeck technology. So in short, this episode is complete and total nonsense. Now, Mark, you're being way too nerdy, caring about things about continuity. What do you think of the episode itself? Well, this episode is really meh. The story about killing holograms is really cliche, especially the leader of the holograms. He was very uninspired stereotype of every egotistical leader and wasn't particularly used well. I mean, the story about the Doctor's split loyalties was interesting enough, which is why I didn't think these episodes totally sucked, because that was an interesting character exploration, but in the end, the story didn't really go anywhere all that worthwhile, so the episode was just okay. So after that, we get Shattered, which I did a full-length review on, so if you want to hear more of my thoughts on that episode, you can check that out. However, suffice to say here, this was a great episode that actually succeeded in connecting Voyager to its past and honoring the show that came before it. This would have made for a much better series finale than Endgame, but with some few adjustments, of course. The premise of the ship being shattered in different time frames is a bit implausible, to say the least, and it's a bit convenient that there doesn't end up being any duplicate versions of people. It just so happens that Paris is in the mess hall and 709 is in the cargo bay, and you know, it all fits together perfectly, so there's just just perfectly one version of each character. Yeah, so that's a bit hard to buy. But this was a great blast from the past, as Chakotay and Janeway encountered many situations from the past, such as Seska and the Kazon, Seven when she's still Borg, the telepathic picture plants, the macro viruses, and Captain Proton. That was a great way to connect Season 7 of Voyager to his roots. And the interactions between present-day Chakotay and the version of Janeway from just before getting stranded in the Delta Quadrant were fascinating, as Chakotay was basically describing everything they'd accomplished, and at the same time Chakotay makes an amazing argument as to why it would be wrong to change the timeline to make it so Voyager isn't trapped in the Delta Quadrant, something that will be completely disregarded in just a few episodes later with that horrible finale, but get to that later. So this was a great episode. However, the ending was a bit forced and there was a lot of logical flaws, but still a great way to reconnect Voyager to its roots. So next we get to Lineage, and this is the prime example of an episode I thought was terrible until my recent rewatch, where I realized it isn't that bad as I remember. In fact, after watching it recently, I actually really liked this episode, and I thought it was actually really good. I suppose the reason why I was really dismissive of this episode before is because it centers around, Tom and B'Elanna relationship, which, as I mentioned before, I never liked. In fact, I feel very strongly it should have never gotten to the point where they're actually having a child together. But that being said, this is perhaps the only episode where the relationship actually worked, and I totally bought it. I also thought the ending with B'Elanna reprogramming the Doctor to force him to perform surgery was a bit over the top and contrived way to create tension in the episode. But that being said, I thought the flashbacks to B'Elanna as a young girl with her father shortly before he left her were absolutely amazing. Great character study that I thought enhanced her current character story perfectly. So all in all, I have to admit that this is actually a really good episode. So next episode is Repentance, and I'm sure there's a good message about the treatment of prisoners and allegories to the fault in our present day penal system. But honestly, I just found this episode boring. I found it really hard to get invested in any of the characters, as they all came off as walking, talking cliches. It was interesting that they had two prisoners, one presented as an irredeemable madman and the other an innocent victim of discrimination. But by the end of the episode, you find out that the madman was simply suffering from a mental illness that can be cured, and the so-called innocent victim of discrimination was actually a devious criminal in disguise. I mean, that reveal was okay, I guess, but it felt a bit too forced, like the writers were trying too hard to go, aha, twist! And it didn't necessarily feel natural to the character, so overall, kind of a forgettable episode. So next episode is Prophecy, and I'm sorry, but there's way too much serendipity in this episode for me to take it seriously. So the one Klingon ship in the Delta Quadrant, the Delta Quadrant is quite vast, it just so happens to run into the one Starfleet ship in the vast Delta Quadrant, and just so happens that they have a prophecy that just so happens to involve an unborn Klingon child at the right time. It just so happens when B'Elanna is pregnant, and it just so happens that the Klingon captain is desperate to end the journey, so he takes advantage of all this serendipity to end the suffering, which just so happens to be fulfilled by a disease that they carried being cured, which just so happens to be cured by B'Elanna's unborn child, which just so happens to fit the prophecy. It's too much. Oh, and by the way, did I mention there were Klingons in the Delta Quadrant? What a lame attempt to, try to, appeal to Trek fans. Ooh, look, Klingons! Just get Voyager back to the Alpha Quadrant already. I'm still a strong proponent that they should have done this at least by Season 7, not wait to the finale. But anyways, this episode was okay. I must admit to being engaged in the plot of Paris and Torres trying to convince the Klingons of this prophecy. But then there's also the matter of all this stupid side plots. as we get a really dumb one with Neelix bunking with Tuvok, and he's acting like a huge dick, just coming in, shoving his way in there, which is just so contrived attempt at comedy. And even worse was the subplot with the Klingon woman having a thing for Harry Kim just because he yelled at her. A bit ridiculous. And don't get me started on that stupid line when Kim tells the doctor about the Klingon woman who wants to have sex with him. The doctor responds by giving him written permission to have sex with an alien, and he suggests that he gets the captain's permission as well. Okay, let me just point out one thing. This alien that the doctor has so graciously given Harry Kim permission to have sex with is a Klingon! It's a fucking Klingon! You know, those aliens that humans had contact with for hundreds of years, and the species to which a human hybrid exists and is a regular cast member on board this very ship that the entire episode is about. And yet, this fucking jackass says, oh, you have permission to have sex with an alien whom we know from centuries of contact and the proven fact that the species is compatible with humans. I know this can of worms was open in the episode The Disease. As I discussed in that episode, it was very hypocritical of Janeway and, you know, other captains like, say, Kirk, that sleeps with anything with two legs. But outside of that precedent, it does make a bit of sense, particularly in the situation in that episode of Disease, as there was a xenophobic species whom relations were a bit sketchy and we had very little knowledge of. So for diplomatic reasons, more than anything else, having secret affairs is not the best idea. But with a well-known established species that we know can mix and create offsprings with humans, I'm sorry, but the doctor's just being a dick. But of course, the real reason that line is there is because the writers thought it would be funny. Ha ha, the doctor telling Harry Kim he has to have sex whether or not he wants to, whether or not he consents to it. Ha ha ha, isn't that funny? God, this just pisses me off, and it ruins any goodwill that this episode established. How little that is. So anyway, let's move on. So, let's thankfully get to The Void, which is surprisingly a great episode. I say surprisingly because from the promos of this episode, it looked like just another Trapped in a Void episode, which has become a tired Star Trek cliche. But then you may say, but they were trapped in the void in this episode. Yes, but they actually did something very different with it than they've done before. Instead of just being just like this weird thing with weird anomalies and weird shit happens and they don't know how to get out, or even worse, it being a B-plot to some boring character story, it was actually about Voyager learning to cooperate with other aliens to form a coalition, even when doing so could mean the death of the entire crew. This, frankly, is what the entire show should have been like, or at least a couple of seasons of it. If the showrunners weren't so goddamn insistent that the show be episodic and running away from continuity as if it was the bogeyman, there would be a lot of potential for an extended storyline like this that doesn't even need to involve a void. Just be about Voyager being alone in the Delta Quadrant, being preyed on by predators, and having to form alliances with other aliens in order to survive. It could have been great, but at the very least we got this one episode. Now granted, we weren't able to explore these alien allies as much as I would have preferred, and then extended storyline, so several things about this episode felt a bit rushed, but it was still really excellent to see. The journey Janeway goes through as she sticks to her laurels, even when it could mean the death of her entire crew, but then it ends up paying off as the others start to see the benefits of cooperation rather than pirating, and they become to realize that if they pool their resources, they may even be able to escape the void, something many felt were impossible. And the characters they go through, character journeys they go through, including some adversaries they gain along the ways, was masterfully pulled off and was a fascinating character journey to see, not just for Janeway but also for the whole crew. It was also interesting seeing Chakotay's character journey. Yes, a season 7 episode that actually explores Chakotay's character. Who knew? As he initially doubted that Janeway's method of sticking to her morals and trying to gain allies would work, And it did. But the thing is that Chakotay wasn't wrong to doubt her. In fact, it's his job as first officer to do so, and he did it well. Because the thing is, Chakotay may have very well been right. After all, as he pointed out, all those who survived in the void so far had done so by preying off of others, so they're basically just a bunch of pirates, and so could have very easily went the other way. So it was great seeing how he grew from this experience. Also, I haven't even gotten to the storyline with Fain Tomi and the other aliens in the void, which was brilliant. I mean, if we leave aside the whole thing about the aliens who are native to the void, a void with no resources whatsoever, not even light, which is frankly impossible. Not just implausible, but impossible. But still, having these aliens around were great, as again, it gave characters like 709 chances to grow as they learned the value of compassion and cooperation. So yes, a fantastic episode, one of the best of the entire show. So next we get into Workforce, which is another great episode, or great episodes, as this was a two-parter, but the character stories explored in these episodes are amazing, and more than that, these are two of the most suspenseful episodes of Voyager. I mean, think about it. In the show's entire run, we see Voyager face off against seemingly unstoppable foes, the Borg, the Hirogen, the Vidians, and yes, even the Kazon, because they were really outnumbered by them. And they faced down many impossible situations like telepathic pitcher plants, macroviruses, highly advanced aliens with cloaking technology that used the crew for lab rats, aliens that attacked the crew in their sleep, aliens capable of slowly replacing the crew with their own people to take over the ship, and so on and so forth. But through all of that, it's a small group of aliens who aren't even that technologically advanced, but yet are highly organized, who represent what I think is the biggest threat Voyager has ever faced in the entire run of the show. Think about it. In this episode, the entire crew, save for 4 people, had their memories wiped and were reprogrammed to be happy workers and were protected by an alien race who were protecting the workers. And more to the point, the crew had been erased or brainwashed to want to stay and to not want to return to Voyager. I mean, really, the only reason they were able to get the crew back in the end was due to the help of some of the aliens who weren't in on this conspiracy to brainwash passing crews. But imagine if this wasn't a shadow conspiracy and this was a government-wide operation and everyone was in on it. Well then, quite frankly, Voyager would have been fucked. Now you may say, well, 709 and Tuvok were still on to them, but without the help of the other Quarrens, they would just kept getting brainwashed over and over again, even if it got to the point where they were lobotomized. Now you may say, well, Chakotay managed to abduct B'Elanna and unprogram her, but if you recall, the conspiracy captured Chakotay and used him to lure Voyager into a trap, and without the help of the other Quarrens, Voyager's rescue attempt would have failed, and they would have all been recaptured and reprogrammed. I mean, sure, there are other examples where Voyager could have been destroyed or whatever, but for some reason, it just seems like higher stakes, or more of an impossible situation where the crew can possibly get out of this. And this is all done by some puny, no-name alien suffering from a labor shortage. And that's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. And let me be clear, I'm glad that it was a conspiracy and not a government-wide operation, because that comes with some brilliant commentary about how some can corrupt the system and do some nasty things for monetary gain. As it was made clear, the architects of this conspiracy were doing it to get rich. They were doing it for money, thus taking advantage of a crisis, in this case the labor shortage, to make money off of the backs of screwing innocent passerbyers over. But what really makes these episodes work is the character stories. Not only were these two of the most intense episodes of the entire series, but also explores the characters in fascinating ways, particularly with Janeway, as the romance was really well done and amazingly well done, and shows the kind of connection Janeway would make if not for the burden of command. And their tragic parting was in fact touching, so this was played out beautifully, which really enhances this intense plot. But granted, we got some BS of Tom and B'Elanna falling for each other, not even knowing who they are, which, like most things in a relationship, comes off as incredibly forced and fake, but whatever. No episode's perfect, but overall, this two-parter is amazing and one of the best of the entire show. So after those great episodes, we bring it back down to Crapville with human error. Now, those who saw my video essay on Endgame would have already heard me rant about the whole 709 Chakotay relationship. However, that rant focused more on Endgame. In fact, I mentioned human error there to say that the relationship in this episode was more excusable because Chakotay was just a hologram, so his image could have been chosen at random, similar to how her date was chosen at random and someone to watch over me. But don't get me wrong, this episode still sucks. Like, a lot. In fact, I can't help but compare this episode to Someone Who Watches Over Me, because that is an example of a great episode about Seven exploring her humanity and experimenting in social situations, and it was pulled off so well. It was fun, it was interesting, it really explored the characters involved in really great ways. This episode is also about Seven exploring more social aspects of humanity, and it's dull, it's boring, and it goes completely against all established character traits. I mean, the way Seven behaves in this episode is completely out of character for her, and the whole thing about her hiding in the holodeck, even to the point of putting the ship in danger and not telling anyone about it, is something that she'd never do, not to mention it's incredibly boring. And seeing her interact with actual people such as the Doctor and Tom Paris or even Neelix would have been far more interesting than running off to the holodeck to have a fake romance with the character she has absolutely no chemistry with whatsoever. So all in all, this is an absolutely horrible episode, and a sign that overall Seven's exploration of humanity was fumbled in season 7 when it was handled so much better in seasons 4 and 5. Another reason why this season was not a great one. Speaking of season 7 not being a great season, next episode is Q2. While I appreciate Voyager actually following up on the Q in the grave by showing what happens with Q's offspring, it was done in a ridiculously uninteresting way. Now, don't get me wrong, this episode wasn't the worst thing ever, but it wasn't particularly interesting either, as it told a pretty stereotypical story of a child misbehaving and Janeway trying to pull him around. Not to mention how fucking annoying this character was at the start of the episode and made this nearly unwatchable. I must admit, it got more interesting once the young Q started behaving and we get more of a storyline as to why he was misbehaving, because he felt abandoned by his parents. But still, it wasn't pulled off the way that it could have been, and in some places it was really predictable, and sometimes the plot moves way too quickly to be believable. So overall, a meh episode. So next episode is Author. So when I did my top 10 funniest Star Trek episodes video, I put this episode on that list, and I completely stand by that stance. The scene alone where Paris reprograms the Doctor's program to make the Doctor a sleazy villain, makes this one of the funniest episodes in the Star Trek franchise. And I would add, that scene is possibly the funniest scene in the Star Trek franchise. It's absolutely hilarious. The rest of the episode was mildly funny, and I think the Doctor's megalomania was exaggerated and taken to a ridiculous extreme in this episode. But I also like the character moments in this episode, particularly when Tom confronts the Doctor about his negative portrayal of the Voyager crew and explains why it personally hurt him, and it's because he thought that he had gained the Doctor's respect. That was a nice touch, and we get another great character moment with the crew getting to talk to their family back in the Alpha Quadrant. We get a couple of great scenes, such as a follow-up to the portrayal of B'Elanna's father earlier in Lineage, where here we see him trying to reconnect with her, and that was just touching, as was the scene where 7 of 9 contacts her long-lost aunt. This was probably the biggest step she took to regain her humanity that we've seen on the show. However, I think all these touching moments and great comedy are undercut by the second half of the episode, which is just a tired, uninspired retread of The Measure of a Man. Don't get me wrong, I love The Measure of the Man. It's one of my all-time favorite Next Generation episodes, but it doesn't require a half-assed retread with holograms instead of androids. And if Voyager did feel the need to do so, I would have preferred it not be tacked on to the second half of a comedy episode of the Doctor being an egomaniac. And plus, I must say, I can't believe the irony is lost on that Boolean publisher guy who loves a story that champions holographic rights and promotes it, and then turns around and tries to deny a hologram his rights. But more than ironic, this is bad writing, as it's unbelievable. I don't buy it, because realistically, that would be horrible publicity for this publisher, which would hurt his company more than the loss of one holo novel. Much more, because he'd be rightfully viewed as a hypocrite who promotes a piece of fiction whose whole point is to promote an issue, but in real life he actively attacks that issue. If that happened in real life, like modern day, like someone made a movie promoting gay rights but then took all the profits of that film and donated it to these anti-gay religious organizations, they would be lauded and the blowback would ruin them, and that's what would happen to this guy, quite frankly. So considering that, I can't help but think of the whole storyline as contrived storytelling that's done simply for plot convenience. And it seems to me the writers simply couldn't maintain a whole comedy episode about the Doctor being an author, and so they threw in this Measure of Man ripoff, and it simply doesn't fit. So this isn't a bad episode, but it's not a particularly good one either. So next episode is Friendship 1, and this is actually an example of an episode that upon my rewatch I realized is actually much worse than I remembered. First of all, let me get it out of the way how stupid it is for them to bring back Joe Carey after not seeing him for 6 years, not in the current timeline anyway, and they bring him back just to kill him off. Why? That's such a freaking waste. It was so dumb. Anyway, on to the episode itself. First of all, the whole concept of Voyager just so happening to be in the right area of a human probe sent out 300 years ago is a bit far-fetched to say the least, and not particularly interesting. But what's more frustrating about this episode is the obtuse manner in which the people of this world they go to react to Voyager's arrival, especially the main villain guy. What an ignorant jackass. I simply don't buy the conclusion that they jump to, that the humans sent a friendly probe that gives away technology freely, knowing that they use it to destroy themselves and then they'd come and conquer them. That is actually a huge leap in logic, and also one that is completely void of self-responsibility. I mean, take some responsibility for your actions. You're the one who blew up yourselves. It wasn't inherently the technology's fault. It's what you did with it. So they need to take responsible for themselves, but no, they won't do that. Instead, they blame the stupid probe instead of actually blaming themselves. And yeah, it is a giant leap in logic to assume that it was the inevitable outcome. It was their fuck up. Now, perhaps I could buy this one leader guy could be this stupid, and his paranoia could infect others and he'd have them convinced. But we get this scientist who, when he was talking to Janeway, talks to her like it's a foregone conclusion. And this guy, shouldn't talk like this because he's a freaking scientist and he shouldn't be that dumb. And even with the leader guy, when the evidence upon evidence keeps piling up to prove that Voyager just wants to help, he still wants to destroy them and holds on to this absurd notion, and I just don't buy it. Another thing that's ridiculous is why Voyager strives to help the planet from its suffering against their will, which has nearly got the ship destroyed. Now, don't get me wrong, I agree with Paris and Neelix's reasoning that they should help the planet and not let entire people suffer because of the actions of one man. But maybe they should get their permission first. I mean, they sent that scientist dude back. Maybe wait until he can talk some sense into them, or at least make it so Voyager wouldn't be put in direct danger before doing so. But of course, if they did that, then we wouldn't have these tense stakes at the end of the episode. In other words, the tension at the end of the episode was fake, contrived, and dumb. So overall, this episode just wasn't very interesting, and I didn't buy a lot of it. It's had a lot of flaws, so not a good episode. So, next episode is Natural Law. This episode is boring. Next. Alright, fine. I'll talk about it a bit more, I guess. But I don't have that much to say about it, other than maybe this was a lame attempt to reconnect Chakotay to his anthropology roots, but it doesn't really do a good job of that. I mean, I kind of understand the dilemma at the end of the episode. Still not sure if I agree with their decision to reinstate an artificial barrier put there by mysterious aliens for unknown reasons. Yes, these guys were clearly going to fuck up the primitive culture, and yes, they were only able to do so because Voyager took down the barrier, but is it really Voyager's place to put up another alien culture's interference with this one planet's natural development? I mean, that's an interesting thought process with the Prime Directive. If they help an unknown alien race interfere with the natural development of an alien culture, is that violating the Prime Directive? I think so. So in other words, this wasn't a very good allegory, as I know they were going for the destructive influence of modern Western culture on less advanced societies, which is a worthwhile message. This episode just does a horrible job at doing it. Oh, and we get a Chakotay in the 7 of 9 story, and yet for some reason the director specifically told the actors not to play out any romantic aspects of their relationship, despite the fact that just a few episodes later the romance resurfaces, but whatever. Also have to mention this stupid side plot about Tom Paris taking flying lessons, which is obviously meant to be like, current day driving lessons for traffic violations. First of all, the whole use of it here is predictable and it's atrocious. And secondly, this is just so dumb and implausible and just a lame attempt at humor. It's a horrible episode. So next episode is Homestead, and once again it's time for everyone's favorite segment, what the fuck are they doing here? Did I say the Herodian War there was example? In this episode we get Flaxians. At the end of season 1 in the episode To Trail, Voyager visited Telex Is, and ever since then, however, they've been moving steadily away from the Telexian homeworld. Now, I already talked about all the time jumps that add up to like 30 years journey between seasons 4 and 7. You can add to that another huge time jump at the end of the episode, The Gift, where Cass took several years off of Voyager's journey by flinging them past Borg space. And more importantly, 6 years of moving away from Telex at high warp. Now, granted, in this episode they talk about how the Telexians are far from home, and Neelix even asks what they're doing out so far. But this severely understates just how far away they are, considering Telexian ships aren't as fast as Voyager, and all the insane jumps that Voyager made. Let's say, at best, they are a 40-year journey from Telex with their ships. So this trip isn't possible unless, like Voyager, the Telexians got boosts from like wormholes and stuff like that. However, they mentioned no such thing, although I suppose it's possible that they just didn't mention it, but you think something like that would be worth mentioning. The other possibility is that they're a generational ship, but that possibility is specifically ruled out because Dexon mentions that Telex is under Harkonian rule and suggests possibly that's the reason why they left in the first place. And the incident where the Harkonians conquered Telex is said to have occurred 22 years before this episode. So they couldn't have left before then. Now, it's possible they could have left directly after that incident, but it's said that for the last 5 years they were on this asteroid building this colony, and although a specific time frame isn't given, Dexon talks about how they had settled on another planet where her husband was killed. Based on her story, this had to have happened at least over several years. So at best, this would have given them roughly 14 years to make a journey of 40 years. But enough of that, let me get into another issue I had with this episode. So this episode is about the fact that they, are bullied wherever they go. In their current home in an asteroid belt, they're being bullied by these aliens who want to mine it for profit. So first of all, in a long-ass journey it took them to get all the way out, like, I can't emphasize that enough, all the way out, they didn't find any unclaimed uninhabited planets that they could settle in, and instead they traveled over 30,000 light years just to settle on an asteroid. I'm sorry, but no way in hell. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds of uninhabitable worlds ripe for settling. Fuck, in the episode Prophecy not too long ago, it took them all of like a day to find the perfect place for the Klingons to settle. So, I'm sorry, but I just do not buy this at all. Not the slightest bit. Also, we get this scene with Tuvok where he suggests they may be bullied wherever they go, so it's more logical to stick up for themselves now. I'm sorry, but that logic is incredibly flawed. It has is a giant assumption to assume there's no planet they could go to where they wouldn't be left alone, as I'm sure there's dozens of such planets. I'm sorry, but Tuvok's advice here sucks. I know they spent 5 years building this colony, but wouldn't they rather live on a nice planet with like an atmosphere and like beaches and forests rather than just a barren asteroid, one that is owned by these other aliens who want to blow it up? As I said, to assume they'd be bothered wherever they go is flat out false. The galaxy is a very big place. And so the plan Neelix comes up with is to put up a shield that the miners can't get through, but, you know, the Telexians have no weapons, so what's to stop the miners from just continually bombarding that shield for years until they're finally able to take it down? But, let's say it's magic and they can never take the shield down no matter how much they bomb it. Something I don't buy for a single second, but for the sake of argument, let's say that. They would essentially be trapped on this asteroid, unable to trade or gather supplies or explore, as soon as they drop the shields to leave, they'd be vulnerable to the miners' attack. Not exactly the best plan. In fact, just earlier in Season 7, in the episode Nightingale, they explored a planet who were hiding behind a shield, who were isolated by a blockade, and how they couldn't leave their world, and how they were slowly being choked to death through lack of resource because they couldn't trade with anyone or anything. So to me, the exact same thing would happen to the freaking Telexians here. But hey, at least they stick up for their home, right? So, the episode itself, it was fine. I mean, it was kind of uninteresting, but it was a good character story for Neelix. It had some great interactions, particularly with Neelix and Tuvok. Despite Tuvok's bad advice, it was great to see him acknowledge his Neelix's worth. And at the end of the episode, when Neelix leaves, it was really touching to see Tuvok do like a dance move to honor Neelix and then say his, people's typical farewell, live long and prosper. It felt like Neelix was on like a 7-year journey to earn Tuvok's respect, and this episode was so satisfying as it showed he has. Now, I do feel about Neelix leaving. How do I feel about Neelix leaving the ship? I mean, it's fine. I mean, he goes to live with Flaxians, and he marries like a single mother, and he becomes a father. So, yeah, that's a good ending for him, I guess. As I was getting out of this episode, I thought it was a pretty contrived way to get Neelix back to his people, rather than just settling on Earth, where he'd be the only Telexian. Frankly, I think I probably would have preferred to see him return to Earth and become an ambassador. Seems like something that he really wanted, and plus would be interesting for a Delta Quadrant alien to live in the Alpha Quadrant. But, this is fine too, I guess. This episode is fine. So next episode is Renaissance Man, and once again we get to our segment, what the fuck are they doing here? This time with these hierarchy aliens last seen in the season 6 episode Tinker Tenure Dr. Spy. Yes! I know they appeared in the episode The Void as well, but they were established to be in their space near the hierarchy and Tinker Tenure Dr. Spy. Their appearance in the Void could be explained away because it was a lone science vessel, so it's possible they were simply long range or just out exploring. But in this episode, they specifically mention the hierarchy has Tweedledum mentions they plan to use the Doctor to infiltrate the hierarchy, where the hierarchy should at least be actually 5 years journey away. 5 years Alright, so that may not be as impressive as a number as I've been throwing around, but still, that is a long-ass journey. In other words, Voyager should be nowhere near this freaking hierarchy. Anyway, as for this episode itself, I have done a full-length review on this episode you can check out for my thoughts on the episode. But to summarize quickly, this episode had a lot of potential that was ruined. The first half of the episode was actually quite interesting, as there was a mystery of Janeway returning from an away mission to say that Voyager had to settle on the planet to avoid being destroyed, but something about her and the whole situation seemed off, and you follow Chakotay as he's investigated, and then it's discovered that this isn't Janeway, it's the Doctor impersonating her, who's under duress, trying to steal Voyager's warp core. So this is all pretty suspenseful, really well pulled off. That is, until the moment where Tuvok had a showdown with the Doctor, as they portrayed the Doctor as some omniscient superhero who's able to outsmart Tuvok in a security and technical matters, which is bullshit. And more than that, he gives some funky kung fu move and does a huge dive and dance and flip and totally shoots Tuvok. Bullshit! That is total bullshit. The Doctor has never displayed these kinds of abilities before. In fact, it was specifically established that he does not have those kinds of skills. And plus, this just makes Tuvok come off as a total putz. But in the end, they end up getting the warp core back because of this stupid cliche storyline of Janeway corrupting the terrorist idiot lackey. Really? Really? That's how you're gonna do this? And then the Doctor gets all scot-free, no repercussions for freaking mutiny, and almost getting Voyager stranded in the freaking Delta Quadrant. He gets like 6 days punishment. Bad, Doctor, bad. Don't mutiny. What the fuck? In this episode is just so preposterous. Really, this was a great opportunity to have Tuvok shine and have him be the one who defeats the Doctor. Finally give him a moment in Season 7. Just please, give him a moment. And it would have been so awesome if he actually outsmarted the Doctor and he stopped the Doctor on his planet and he was the one that took Voyager and figured a way to get Janeway back. Not this stupid subplot about his lackey being dumb. But no, the writers' heads are so far up the Doctor's ass, they had to make Tuvok look like an idiot and make the Doctor look like a god. It's ridiculous. Simply ridiculous. So not only was this a bad episode, but it's a waste of potential, as it could have been a great episode had the ending been handled better, and that's actually more frustrating to me. So, finally we get to the lame-ass excuse for the finale episode of Star Trek Voyager, the worst finale in television history, Endgame. Now, I could talk for hours about how much this episode sucks. In fact, I have recently. Recently I did a video that's over an hour and a half that examines why this episode is a failure. So if you want my full thoughts on this episode, you can check out that video. But the too long didn't watch version of that is that basically this is an episode written by a business exec where he just throws in like all elements, just throw it against the wall that he thinks will make money, like time travel, the Borg, the Klingons, Lieutenant Barclay, a 709 romance, regardless if any of these things are necessary to telling a good story. So this results in an episode with an unbelievable amount of plot holes, where the very structure doesn't make any sense and is inherently flawed, as is based on a future version of Janeway disregarding the entire principles that the show has been building up for the entire 7 years, and she shows favoritism as she alters the timeline, which could negatively affect billions in order to save her two good friends, Tuvok and 709, where everyone else in Voyager has already died at this stage, while she doesn't give two shits about them. And then the storyline with the Borg makes no sense as they introduce this transwarp hub, which makes them unbelievably powerful to the point where not only is it a major plot hole that they haven't assimilated Earth years ago, but also a giant plot hole on why they haven't assimilated the entire freaking galaxy by now. And of course, add to that, the Borg Queen coming off as a cartoon character, cartoon villain. It's ridiculous. And to top it all off, the episode ends abruptly as soon as Voyager returns home, thus robbing audiences of the cathartic character moments we've been waiting 7 years to see, and thus effectively saying to its audience, fuck you, thanks for wasting your time, suckers! So, in short, this is the worst series finale of all time, the worst Star Trek Voyager episode of all time, and one of the worst episodes of the Star Trek franchise. This episode can go fuck itself. So, finally, that is all of Season 7. So now let me get into my picks for the best and worst episodes of Season 7, starting with the worst episode. Now, for this title, what could I possibly choose? Could it be Friendship 1, Repression, Human Error, Unimatrix 0, maybe Drive? Yeah, that's it. I'm going to choose Drive. Oh, come on, it's obviously Endgame. Endgame is the worst episode of anything Voyager. This is the most disappointing, wasted potential, badly written piece of garbage that does a huge disservice to the great show that came before it. So now, let me get into my pick for the best episode of Season 7. Now, I could mention episodes like Critical Care, Shattered, and Lineage, but really this only comes down to 2 episodes, The Void and Workforce, which were the only 2 really great episodes of Season 7. But out of the 2, I think I'm going to have to go with The Void. An amazing episode that shows, in one episode, the journey Voyager, should have taken, but still, this was a real tribute to Star Trek as it upheld its principles and showed the value of cooperation and friendship even in the face of certain death. A truly great episode. Now, as for my rating out of 10 for Season 7 as a whole, I'm going to have to give this a 4 poor. Most of the episodes this season were throwaway average episodes that just felt forgettable and weren't very remarkable. There were 2 great episodes plus 3 pretty good episodes, but the rest of the episodes were either okay but flawed or outright terrible. And of course, there were quite a few of these outright terrible episodes, including the worst ending any show has ever had, making this a pretty subpar season indeed. So that's it for my Star Trek Voyager Season 7 review. So now let me get into what I'll be doing next, as I plan on keeping up my monthly episode-by-episode reviews of each season of a show for the foreseeable future. However, I'm not done with my coverage of Star Trek Voyager yet, as next month I will be doing 3 videos. My top 7 seasons of Voyager, my top 30 worst episodes of Voyager, and my top 50 best episodes of Voyager. Thus, I will wrap up my coverage of Voyager with a bang, examining what I think is the worst and best of Voyager based off of my recent rewatch. And these numbers may not necessarily match up with any previous top 10s or other videos I've done in the past, because I'm just basing it off of this rewatch. But instead of waiting until all those videos to tell you which show I will cover after Voyager and keep you in suspense, I'll go ahead and announce it now that after much contemplation and deliberation, I decided the next show I will cover monthly will not be a Star Trek show, but Babylon 5. Babylon 5 is something that has been requested for me to cover on my channel many times for years. So I thought I'd finally get to it, and rather than just doing one video for it, I feel this deserves the monthly treatment. I've only seen the show once, about 9 years ago, and I liked it, but I didn't think it was anywhere near the masterpiece many now claim it to be. But I thought I'd give it another go, and as I watch it, I'll also watch some reviews from those who love this show to see what it is exactly that people love so much about this show. However, fans of Babylon 5 may not be too pleased with my reviews, as I probably won't be as generous to it as they prefer, as I never really felt as highly about it as many other has. But hey, I thought I'd give it a fair go and report exactly what I think. But as I said, I won't start doing this for another 2 months. So in early February, I'll do my Voyager countdowns to wrap up my Voyager coverage, and in early March, I will begin my Babylon 5 coverage. And I do plan on getting to Deep Space Nine and Next Generation eventually, but I decided to do Babylon 5 first. So be sure to keep an eye on my channel for that, as well as Star Trek episode reviews that I do, which is determined by my user polls, and I also cover many other shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Black Mirror, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.